Okay. Thank you, everybody, for coming. Sorry for the technical issues. Tonight, we are beginning the study of one of the most controversial and famous berachot of Shmona Esrei. I'm almost embarrassed to start talking about this beracha since there's so much literature that has been written about this beracha. There's literally 2 books at least written on this beracha. Volumes and volumes and volumes of literature have been written about this beracha. And the reason for this, the reason for the interest is mostly because of the Christian scholarship. And that took that was especially true after the Holocaust, when Christian scholars began to take an introspective look at the relationship between Christians and Jews and how anti-Semitism had reached its pinnacle and its zenith during the Holocaust. So Christian scholars wanted to look deeply into the relationship between the Jews and the Christians, especially from the earliest times. They wanted to look at the so-called, what they called the parting of the ways, or how Judaism and Christianity separated one from the other at the earliest times, not just in the life of Yeshu, but also in the centuries afterwards. And the discussion of this bracha, the Berachas HaMinim, as we shall see, became central to that discussion. Now, modern scholarship has distanced itself a little bit from that older model. The older model was that there was a mother-daughter dichotomy between Judaism and Christianity, where Christianity would be a so-called child religion to Judaism. However, with better data today, it doesn't seem that that's quite how that worked. It does seem that in the time of Bayesheni, there were multiple let's call it sects, multiple sects in Eretz Yisrael, who each had their own biblical and messianic idea of how to interpret the Nevuos and the prophecies which within the 5 books of Moshe and also within Nach. And of all those sects, we have a few of them that survived, like the Rabbanim and the Christians. And let me just mute somebody. You have the Karaim who survived, which are children of the Tzedaikim. It's even the Samaritans to a degree survived. So the mother-daughter dichotomy is a little bit dated, but that was essentially what the impetus for this volume of literature that came to be around the Berachas HaMinim. Now, last time we learned together, we discussed the Berachas HaMishpat. And the lesson I wanted to impart from studying the Berachas HaMishpat is that when you take a piece of data, when you take a piece of evidence regarding tefillah, you can't look at that piece of evidence as if it's the monopoly on truth, as if that evidence, because it's from a certain source, is automatically a monopoly on the truth of what happened and how it happened. You have to take that piece of evidence in context. What is its date? What is its geography? Who are the people that wrote it? You have to take that piece of evidence in context in order to understand it more deeply. So that's the approach we're going to take tonight, especially with the Berachas HaMinim, because all of the data there has to be taken in context. And tonight, we're going to especially be looking at both Jewish and Christian sources from the early part of the millennium in order so that we could get a better understanding of what the Berachas HaMinim might have been in its inception and as it evolved throughout the millennia. And again, I'm a little embarrassed to be giving a shir about this with the limited time we have and with the limited knowledge that I have about this subject, but we'll do our best. Okay, so let's begin with the Gamar. That's my favorite place to start. Simply a Gamar. The Gamar here on Daf Chav Chesamad Beis in Brachos is discussing the Shemona Esrei. The Amidah, this is one of the most famous Gemaras, one of the most important when we discuss the Amidah. So let's look right here on right here where it says Hani, where my mouse is moving. It says the Gemara, Hani Tamni Srei. These are 18 brachot. Tishasrei Havyan. These are 19 brachot. If you count them, they're 19. Amar Bilevi answered, Birkat Hatzidokim. Right, this is the censored version of the Talmud, which is really Berachas HaMinim, B'Yavne Tiknua. They instituted it in Yavne. Keneged Mim Tiknua. So the Gemara says, wait, I thought I had a whole system for understanding the number. And it answers, okay, it's for the 19th part of the spine, etc. A different extra part of the pasuk, etc. Okay, so we have this tradition that the Birchas HaMinim, the bracha made for the so-called heretics, was instituted in Yavne, where the rest of the Shemoneh Esrei was also so-called instituted. And we've discussed the complexities of that before. Tana Rabbanan, let's look at the bottom of Gemara. Shimon HaPekoli, Shimon the flax worker, Histir Yudchet Brachot Lefnei Rabbi Gamliel. He arranged the order of the 18 brachot in front of Rabbi Gamliel. Al HaSeder b'Yavne, according to their order at Yavne. What this means, we've discussed before, is a matter of controversy. Some say that they were instituting it fresh. This is going to be a new liturgy with not just fresh, it was going to have a definite, what do you call it? It was going to have a definite nusach, a definite language. And some say, no, he was just arranging the order alone. And they never created a special nusach, meaning you first set up avos, then gvuros, then kedushos, then das, then etc., etc. A slicha and shuva. But they never actually deliberated on a specific nusach. The truth is probably somewhere in between, and we'll get to that soon. Amar lahem Rabbi Gamliel HaChachamim. Here comes the strange part. Rabbi Gamliel gets up in front of the Chachamim. It doesn't say when. It doesn't say if it's at this council. The Gamar doesn't care about history, by the way. History for history's sake is not important to the Gamar. It only brings history when it matters for the halacha. Amar Rabbi Gamliel said to the Chachamim, is there not a person who knows how to institute a bracha against the heretics? Amad Shmuel HaKatan. Shmuel HaKatan rose up among all the men, V'tikna, and he instituted a bracha against the heretics. L'shana acheres shechacha, the next year, he forgot it. V'hishkif b'ashtayim v'shal shais v'loy halua. Essentially, what the Gemara is saying is, the Shmuel HaKatan got up and he instituted a bracha. Next year, he didn't remember it. He tried to remember it for 2 to 3 hours, and they didn't become suspicious of him, meaning that the whole point of the bracha was that if a shliach tzibur was to say this in public, if he was going to skip it or to fumble his words, it's probably because he himself was a heretic and he didn't want to curse himself. Therefore, when Shmuel HaKatan forgot it the next year, they didn't remove him as a shliach tzibur because he was the one himself who instituted the prayer, so they didn't suspect him of becoming a heretic. So when we say Birchas HaMinim, essentially what we mean is Klalas HaMinim. This is what the Torah actually calls it. He calls it Klalas HaMalshinim or Klalas HaMeshumadim, I believe. The curse of the apostates, not a bracha. However, because there's a technical halachic liturgical term called a bracha, benediction, we apply it here too, and we call it Birchas HaMinim. We don't call it the Klalas HaMinim or the malediction of the minim of the heretics. We call it Birchas HaMinim, the bracha, but that's only a technical detail. Now, who is Shmuel HaKatan? We've already discussed that we almost know nothing about Shimon HaPekoli, Shimon the flax worker. The Mekubalim believe that he was the receiver of the tradition all the way back to the Anshe Knesset HaGedolah. He was the last person to remember the Seder. However, Shmuel HaKatan we know a little bit about. We have other Gemaras about Shmuel HaKatan. The Gemara in Sanhedrin, Daf Yud Aleph Amud Aleph, says that Shmuel HaKatan was such a great person that a bas kol came down to the Chachamim in Yavne, and an echo from the heavens came down and said that Shmuel HaKatan was so pious that he was worthy that the Shekhinah should rest upon him as it did Moshe Rabbeinu. And after he died, they would lament for him that he was what a pious person he was, that the Shekhinah should have fallen upon, should have rested upon him. Furthermore, we know the Mishna in Pirkei Avos, Mishna Perek Dalid Mishna Yotes says that Shmuel HaKatan Omer Shmuel HaKatan would say the pasuk in Mishlei, Ben fol oivecha al tismach u'birkashlo al yaga lebecha pen yira Hashem v'rabbeinu v'heshiv me'alav apo. He was the one who used to say over this pasuk in Mishlei. It's not that he invented this pasuk in Mishlei. It's the only Mishnah where the saying of a sage is only a pasuk. He was the one who was very sensitive towards people who didn't agree with him and his enemies, which is a beautiful thing. Shmuel HaKatan himself, the humblest of all the rabbis around him, the most peace-loving rabbi of the rabbis around him, was the one to institute the bracha against the Meshumadim, against the apostates. A very beautiful lesson we learn here. This Mishnah itself is a little complicated because how could this be his saying? What does it mean that he was the one who said it? There's a bunch of interpretations. Some say that this is what he was, ragil, that he was regular. to say, some people say it's a drasha, b'nfol levecha al tisamach, don't gladden somebody else, but be that as it may, this is the evidence we have from the time of the Tanoim. The first evidence we have from the time of the Tanoim. So we have a Messiah from in the Gamara that in Yavne, Shmuel Katan at the council of Rabbi Gamliel at the end of the 100s instituted a bracha against the Minim. Now, we have to compare this to a contemporaneous source in order to understand why this was reflected, where people thought that Beracha HaMinim had to do with the Christians. So there's a verse in John. Forgive me if you're Jewish and you don't really know any New Testament, neither do I, but it says as follows. It says, and John was finished between the year 90 and 110. It's contemporaneous with Rabbi Gamliel. It says his parents said this because they were afraid of Jewish leaders who said that they had already decided that anyone who acknowledged that Yeshua was the Messiah would be put out of the synagogue. That's what it says in the New Testament. So there was a scholar in the 60s named Louis Martin who said, well, why would people be thrown out of the synagogue because they believed in Yeshua? And he deliberates and he says, well, it must be because they were thrown out of the synagogue because of the Beracha HaMinim. The whole point of the bracha was that if somebody was a heretic, he wouldn't be able to say it. He'd fumble his words. He didn't want to curse himself. So this must be the Beracha HaMinim, and that's what John is referring to in the book of John. The problem with this is that all later scholars dismiss this for many, many reasons. But to simplify, the most compelling reason for why to dismiss this is that we have no evidence that Christianity was a threat to the rabbinate in the 1st or 2nd century. This is a nice story that people like telling, that Rabbi Gamliel was a crusader launched a crusade against Christianity. And some people like to even borrow this story for the Haggadah Shel Pesach and say that a lot of the statements of Rabbi Gamliel in the Haggadah Shel Pesach are anti-Christian in nature. The problem is we have zero evidence for this fact. We have nothing to support for this hypothesis. We have nothing to support that the Christians as a group posed any such threat. We know that in the 1st century, from their own writings, that they were a small group of sectarians. They were a small group that first started in the hundreds and then slowly grew to the thousands, mostly in Eretz Yisrael, and then they spread to Rome and to other places. Now, while this group might have been an annoyance to the rabbis, they might have been a tremendous annoyance, they did not pose a threat. There were bigger groups like the Essenes or like the Tzedokim who posed a much more real political threat to the Rabbanim. So when the Gamar says Minim, the heretics, why would you assume that that means Christians? There's no reason to assume that Rabbi Gamliel was more than familiar with the Christian sect. Now, to give you a mashal to this, just and forgive me if you're Chabad, but I'll give you a mashal. We know that there's a segment of Chabad which is very Mashiachas, very messianic, very loud, and very annoying to people in Chabad who are not messianic. Now, if you're a regular, let's call it Orthodox Jew, you would look to people of that faith to be at most annoying because they wear the same hat, they have the same beard, they speak the same language, but they kind of believe a different faith. They believe that the Messiah already arrived, or that he's going to have a second coming, and that there's more important books than our standard canon. So yeah, that might be really annoying, but is that a political threat to mainstream Judaism? No, not yet. It's not a threat. Are we launching crusades against the Mashiachos department of Chabad? No, we are not. Are they a problem? Yes. Does the Cherem crusade approach work? No, it doesn't work. That's not how we're going to approach it. While in let's say, take America in the 50s and 60s, the reform and the conservative movements were a much greater threat, so to speak, to orthodoxy, and that was where we had a lot of tension. But the let's say, as an example, the Mashiachos department of Chabad, which is smaller and louder, are not necessarily a threat. Rabbi Gamliel wouldn't get in front of the entire council at Yavne and say, let's compose a bracha just for the Christians. That simply doesn't make sense, and no evidence supports it. We simply don't have any evidence to support such a hypothesis. Okay, now let's move on to the Tosefta. The Tosefta is a source which is roughly contemporaneous with the Mishnah, perhaps about 10 years, 20 years earlier than the Mishnah. This Tosefta throws a wrench in many of our understandings of other Gemaras, whether they be in Bavli and Yerushalmi and other Brises, because this Tosefta seems to reflect a very early version of events. Says the Tosefta, Shmei Nesei Bracha Shamru Chachamim, Keneged Shmei Nesei Atzkar Shebavu Lashem B'nei Elim. The 18 brachas of Shmei Nesei correspond to the 18 Shem Hashems in the Tehillim of the parak of Havu Hashem B'nei Elim. This is well known, and the Gemara expounds upon this. Next, what does the Brisa say in the Tosefta? Kailel Shalminim B'Shal Prushim. You can combine or say the bracha of minim in the bracha of the prushim, the bracha of those sectarians. B'Shal Geirim B'Shal Zakenim, the bracha of the Geirim, the bracha of the converts in the bracha of the Zakenim, the bracha of the elders. B'Shal David, and the bracha of David in the bracha of Bnei Yerushalayim. Im Amar Elu La'atzman ve'Elu La'atzman, but if you say all those brachos separately, you're Yotzei. This bracha is an atomic bomb for all those scholars who study Shemay Esrei, because what seems to be here is that not that Rabbi Gamliel in Yavne created 18 fixed or 19 fixed brachos with a specific text, but what it looks like here is, as Rabbi Yosef Heinemann aptly points out, he looks like there were various different brachos with various different topics that were circulating in the time of the early Rabbanim. And the favorite ones, the most important ones that were created by these various social circles were regulated and regularized by the rabbis, by the Rabbanim, and they created this 19 brachas of Shemona Esrei, because we have this bracha of Gerim and a bracha of Zakenim, a bracha of David and a bracha of Bnei Yerushalayim. And strangely, we also have a bracha of Minim and Prushim, two separate brachas. Now, the bracha of David and Bnei Yerushalayim, we know from history, because we know in Eretz Yisrael that the bracha, the version of the Nusach in Eretz Yisrael was Elokei David Bnei Yerushalayim. They combined the two concepts into one bracha. And in fact, the Yerushalmi says 18 brachas are 17 brachas. Oh, we have Minim, and that makes it 18 brachas, which is its own complexity. Now, Gerim and Zakenim, we've never heard of a bracha of Gerim and Zakenim separately, and we'll discuss that very shortly. But Minim and Prushim, that sounds like there was a separate bracha for heretics and a separate bracha for sectarians. So what in the world is going on here? So it was Saul Lieberman and Tosefta Kipshuta and Rabbi Yosef Heinemann who both suggest that what happened with Shmuel HaKatan is that he's adding a bracha to an already existing bracha that was called Birkat HaPrushim, and he wasn't inventing something out of thin air. Essentially, there was already a malediction, some sort of curse that was said by the Jewish people in the synagogues against people who are heretics. And up on top of that, Shmuel HaKatan composed the Berachas HaMinim, which is why the Berachas HaMinim has a form of composite structure where it includes different types of enemies, both internal and external, to Klal Yisrael. This is a really interesting theory, really complicated theory, because who would have been those sectarians first that they were speaking about? And second of all, if we return to the Gamar for a second, the Gamar says, Lishana acheres shachacha. The next year, Shmuel HaKatan forgot it. Why next year? What in the world was going on? It sounds like, and this is something Lieberman himself suggests, that they didn't say the Berachas HaMinim every day. Berachas HaMinim, or maybe the Berachas HaPrushim beforehand, the bracha of the separatists beforehand, was only said on special occasions or one time a year, maybe Rosh Hashanah. We just don't know. But that's the reason why the next year when Shmuel HaKatan was called to the Torah, called to say the bracha, he forgot the exact text of bracha, and only after a few centuries did the Berachas HaMinim become a part and parcel of the regular tefillah. Now, this is all conjecture. This is all hypothesis. As far as we know, in the Dor HaTanoim, there was a bracha. Just to summarize, what we know from the Dor HaTanoim is there was a bracha. It was called Berachas HaMinim. It was a bracha, a curse, so to speak, against the heretics. Most likely, this bracha was against sectarians in general. And if we had to guess, if we didn't have any Christian influences, we would probably guess that it was directed primarily against the Tzedokim or the Essenes. However, there are contemporaneous Christian sources which sound like the Jews cursed them specifically in the synagogue, or at least threw them out of the synagogue, which raises the question as to whether or not the Rabbanim cared very much about the Christians in their time. We also see some evidence here in the Dar HaTanoim that there was another bracha called Birkas HaPrushim, and perhaps Birkas HaMinim was just an extension or a composite of Birkas HaPrushim. That's so much for the Dar of the Tanoim. Now, the Dar of the Amayroim, not much changes. All we know is that they call it the Birkas HaMinim, and they have this Messiah. But if you go a few years later, from the Dar Tanoim, we have something called the Dialogue of Trifo by somebody named Justin Martyr. Justin Martyr was a guy who lived in Eretz Yisrael in Shomron. He was a convert to Christianity, a fairly early convert to Christianity. And in one of his books called the Dialogue of Trifo, he says this. He says, and you clearly see that this has come to pass, for you curse in your synagogues all those who are called from him Christians, and other nations effectively carry out the curse, putting to death those who simply confess themselves to be Christians. Sounds like a bit later than John, you have another Christian claiming that the Jewish people specifically curse Christians in their synagogues. Much later, 200 years later or so, we have two of the church fathers, one Jerome and one Epiphanius. And I'll just read you from Epiphanius, who says it very almost explicitly. He says, yet these are very much Jews' enemies. Not only Jewish people have a hatred of them, they even stand up at dawn, at midday, and toward the evening, 3 times a day, when they recite their prayers in the synagogues, and curse and anathemize them. 3 times a day they say, God cursed the Nazareans. And if you look in Jerome says that it's the bracha of the Mineos. They call it the Minim, the bracha of the Minim. So clearly, in the 300s, we have 2 Christian men who are aware of a bracha said 3 times a day, which is against the Christians. Now, I don't believe for a second that Epiphanius really knew the bracha inside the shul, and I don't believe that they actually said God cursed the Nazareans. But what he's probably speaking about is the language of Notstrom, because there's a very early epithet, a very early term used by Jewish people, which is Notstrom. And most scholars have taken that to mean Nazarenes, people who believe in the Nazarene faith, or so to speak, Christians. And therefore, it's probable that if he said God cursed the Nazareans, it's probable that the earliest bracha had the word Notstrom in it. And that's what we're going to see from the Cairo Geniza. Let's fast forward from the 300s, where it's the last time we have any specific data about this, that there is specific words in the bracha. If we fast forward almost 600 years, maybe 400 or 500 years, we get the first evidence of what the earliest bracha looked like. Now let's look at this chart together. This chart has on the right side the Minhag HaBavli, and on the left side Minhag HaYerushalmi. This is from an article by Uri Erlich and Ruth Langer. I think it's about 2003 or so. The standard bracha, if you're going to look here, there's different branches. In Eretz Yisrael, it was very simple. La mishumadim alti tikva, umalchus adon meherat ta'aker b'yameinu, v'hanotzrim v'haminim kerege ovedu. Right, there's different branches of it, as you can see, and then it ends imachu m'sefer chayim v'im tzadikim ali katevu, baruch Hashem machnia zedim. While in the Nusach HaBavli, if you have, let's say, the most dominant 2, you'll have la mishumadim alti tikva. It starts with the same words. For the apostates, there should be no hope. Malchut zadom meherat ta'aker shaber. Some have vitachnia b'yameinu, and it also has v'hanotzrim, v'haminim, and the Nazarenes and the Christians, kirege avedu, should be in an instant destroyed. V'chol ovei amacha v'tzorim meher yokaretu. Baruch atah Hashem shover rishayim u'machnia zedim, and some of them have shover oivim, should destroy the enemies, and machnia zedim. The difference, obviously, between Rishayim and Oivim is that one is more internal, like the evildoers, and one is more external, the enemies. That seems to be the enemies of Klal Yisrael. Now, let's examine this a little bit step by step. First of all, every Nusach in Klal Yisrael at this time does not begin with La Malshinim, which is, we'll see a bit of a later edit. All of the Nusach, every Nusach in Klal Yisrael began with La Mishumadim Alti Tikva, and the Temanim still do this to this day, because the Temanim lived in Muslim lands and they were never ever afraid of Christians censoring their texts. So they always said La Mishumadim Alti Tikva. To the apostates there should be no hope. What does it mean, no hope? We don't know. We don't know what it means, no hope. I saw one scholar suggest it means no hope for salvation. in a sense that, well, if it's Christianity or if it's the some other sect of Judaism, then it would be they should have no hope for messianic salvation. Maybe, but that would be an admission on the part of the rabbis of the Rabbanim that they believe that there's some hope for salvation for these people. Well, they didn't. So why would they write that into the liturgy? So I'm not quite sure if you could really say that. But this is also the object of controversy, because who is this insolent kingdom? Is it Rome? Would they have been so arrogant? Would they have been so brave to write a bracha explicitly against Rome? It could be. It could be a later edit. We don't know. But it says ta'aker, shaber, tachnia, b'yameinu. Then it says v'hanotzim v'haminim kerege avedu should instantly be doomed. And then we have the rest of the brachas. You could see branch 5 here is probably the most similar to the order that we have today in our siddur. That's the order that we have in most of our siddurim today. That's the order of the bracha. And the reason for this is because the siddur of Amram is the one that mostly, repeats branch 5 over here. Now, what's notable about branch 5 is that it takes out v'hanotzim v'haminim kerege avedu. In the time of Amram Gaon, which is, again, he lived in Muslim lands, not in Christian lands, they already began taking away this nusach of notzim v'haminim. The question is why? Why does Amram Gaon, who is not afraid of Christians, take this out? So either it's because this is a very valid early nusach, and notzim v'haminim is later, which is, I think, unlikely because so many other nuschais have it. Or you could say that this is internal censorship, because what he's doing is saying, we don't need this anymore. We're not a threat of Christians. We don't live in these lands. Let's not say it. And if Saadia Gaon does the same, he doesn't say about Notzim Ramin and Kerege Avedu, which would be an internal edit, regardless, because the Seder of Amram doesn't contain these words. Almost all of the rites in Europe, all of them, the Spanish, the Italian, the Ashkenaz, all of them omit, not all, but okay, most of them, omit the term v'hanotzim v'haminim kerege avedu, much to our advantage. The irony is here that there were some nuschais, I believe it's Romaniyot and perhaps Italian, which retain notzim v'haminim, but many nuschais retained v'chol haminim kerege avedu. And ironically, in the early medieval times, minim was just taken for granted to mean Christians, so it didn't really help that you took out notzim. Even if notzim was an explicit reference, if this was internal censorship, it's kind of ironic to take out notzim because minim also means Christians as the way they defined it. Again, in every generation, people define minim as differently, but in medieval times, they clearly defined minim as Christians. So some brachos began to censor this as well. Okay. This culminates in the Disputation of Paris in 1240. Up until the 1200s, we don't have too much evidence for censorship of this bracha. It seems that almost every rite, every medieval rite, seems to have had the Girsa of L'Mishmadim al Tikva. Right here, I'll show you the Nusach Romaniyot, the Nusach Italia, the Nusach Ashkenaz, the Nusach Tzarfat, and Sfarad. Almost all of these are very clear. They say Minim, Al-Mashinim, the Mosrim, all of these people, the Kofrim, they're very elaborate. As you see, the Gaonic version, if you're looking at the screen, was embellished because they had no problem embellishing and adding all the things they wanted. They got explicit. They had no problem embellishing and adding everyone, the Kofrim, the Malshinim, the Mosrim, you name it. Everybody who wishes ill to us. However, so began a little problem with a man named Nicholas Donin. You see, Nicholas Donin was a man who lived in France, and he was a Jewish man. I forgot his original Jewish name. I don't know if we know it. But he was put into Cherem by Rabbi Yechiel Paris and Rabbi Yechiel of Paris. And we don't know exactly why or exactly when, but it seems in around 1225 he was put into Cherem. And Nicholas Donin eventually went and converted to Christianity, and then marched on to Rome to the Pope, Gregory IX, and he listed a charge of like 35 charges against the Talmud. And he studied the Talmud, and he looked at it, and he said, look at all these blasphemous things that the Talmud says about Christianity. They hate Yeshu. They think that he's unholy, and they curse Yeshu, and all these things. And Gregory the Ninth was very oppressed, and he sent out an order to all the lands. Everybody should ban the Talmud and turn them in and burn them. And none of the kings listened because none of the kings were interested. And most of the kings didn't really heed to the church, even though the church was fairly ascendant. The Jews gave them most of their tax money. It wasn't worth it to start fighting with the Jews about one of their books. Like, please, okay, okay, Pope Gregory. Most of them ignored it. Louis the Ninth went ahead and decided, you know what? Let's begin a trial. We're going to do a trial of the Talmud because he was a little bit more pious, and he decided he was going to at least put the Talmud on trial. So he calls Nicholas Donin, and he calls 4 rabbis to defend the Talmud. It would be Martyr, it would be Moshe Mikusi, I believe it was, and 2 other rabbis from France. Some of the greatest Balei Tosafot, some of the greatest rabbis ever lived. And they wiped the floors with Nicholas Donin. Essentially, every charge that he brought, they made a mockery of him. And from the reports that we have, it seems that even King Louis was entertained. He thought it was hilarious. One of the most famous lines that Rabbi Chilme Paris said was that this is just funny history. That Nicholas Donin claimed that the Gamar about Tseir is Seches, and the Gamar about all the Gemaras about Yeshu were talking about Jesus of Nazareth. They were talking about their God. And that's what the Gemara was speaking about. This Yeshu was their Yeshu. So Rabbi Chilme Paris said in French, not every Louis born in France is king. In other words, not every Yeshu mentioned in the Gemara is the Yeshu of Minotzer. Not every single one is going to be. Yeshua was a very common name. It's not like you could say that every single apostate in the Gemara called Yeshu was Yeshu Hanotzri. Therefore, that's one of the most famous lines. Not every Louis in France is king, and the King Louis enjoyed that very much, despite the fact that all of these arguments were lost. And I think one of his most impressive arguments was that he argued that Saint Jerome studied the Talmud and found no objection. If Jerome had no objection, what's changing now? He asked the king directly, why suddenly now do you think that suddenly there's objections to the Talmud almost 800 years later? Please, this is all allegations. These are baseless. Nicholas Donin is just a self-hating Jew, and he has psychological problems. Please dismiss all of this. The problem is that the king could not see to the embarrassment of the clerics. He made the priests also debate the rabbis, and he could not allow the priests to have lost. So therefore, it set off a chain of events where eventually all the Jews had to hand in their Talmuds by order of the state, and eventually almost 12,000 wagon loads of Talmuds were burned in France. This was a tremendous, I think it was in 1242, a tremendous tragedy, which was also, there was a kinna written about it from Arami Rottenberg. So one of Nicholas Donin's greatest charges was that Berachas HaMinim was a curse against Christians. And of course, Rabbi Chilme Paris disputed this, but so began the publicity of this Berachas HaMinim, and the Christians became aware of it, that Berachas HaMinim existed. The problem is that the church was not yet powerful enough to go ahead and censor all of the texts or all of the prayers. They couldn't walk into every synagogue and say, okay, nobody can say the church didn't have that power. There are too many synagogues, and they couldn't censor every manuscript. But we do find in medieval times some manuscripts crossing it out, like in self-censorship, in case the galach would come, in case the priest would come to examine their work. They would have a ready self-censorship that we see in medieval texts. But the majority of medieval texts do have a plethora of curses for all sorts of apostates and heretics and anybody who tries to do ill towards the Jewish people. Now, the one nusach that we are lacking some data for is Nusach HaSfarad, because we don't really have as many manuscripts from Spain as we do from Ashkenaz and other places. But okay, that's the, in front of me is a concise summary of the data that we do have. Now, there's been a tremendous amount of research done on Berachas HaMinim throughout the Middle Ages. Most notably, I'll point out this book, not just Middle Ages, but also in modern times, the book Cursing the Christians by Ruth Langer. and Yaakov Tepler's PhD dissertation called Birkat HaMinim, originally in Hebrew but translated into English. Unfortunately, these books are very expensive and hard to find. If you could get a copy or you could afford a copy, God bless you. But these books do an excellent job of the history, a very, very good job of doing the history of the Birkat HaMinim. And one of the most interesting things I want to discuss about this history is that the modern era was mostly shaped by the Italian rite. Now, as I just showed you, the Italians were the only ones to have a nusach that says La Malshinim in the beginning. But strangely, it starts Vil La Malshinim with a Vav. Why is that? So the most obvious answer would be that it probably began with La Meshumadim Vil La Malshinim, or La Minim Vil La Malshinim. However, because of censorship, of internal censorship, they refused to write the first word. But the Italians were the only ones to have this introduction to the bracha. We can't really assume that it's a real nusach. We are going to assume that it's a fake, that it's almost like a self-censored version. And therefore, Italy was the most influential place for the development of the bracha as we know it today, because Italy had a proximity to the church center. It was the most proximate to the church center. And because the Italians, even in medieval times, were most scared of the censorship of the church, they were the first ones to start internally censoring the bracha. Because they censored the bracha and they started it with V'la Malshinim, in their printing houses, they also censored the bracha. And as any person who knows even a little bit about Jewish history would know, Italy was the haven for the printing houses of all the early Jewish books. From the Sonsino press to many of the other presses, Italy was the hub for Jewish printing. And because Italy, as a printing press, was under the censorship of the church, they had to disguise this bracha, the Birkat HaMinim, from the fear of the censors. Now, in Ashkenaz, they didn't have exactly the same problem, but because the Italians were in charge, the Italians were constantly sending out prayer books that began the bracha with La Malshinim or Vila Malshinim instead of the standard La Mishumadim. Now, most Jews in the time, in the early 16th century, were aware. They understood what to do. They read it in the Siddur, but they said it otherwise. So, I don't know how many, besides the Romaniot version, how many printed versions we have that still have La Mishumadim. You see, the censorship of the printed text began in the 16th century with the anti-Reformation. As Martin Luther began reforming the church, the anti-Reformation movement of the Catholic Church began censoring all sorts of texts, and especially the Jews. So in the 16th century, the Jews became much more wary of censorship. And even in Ashkenaz, they made sure to get Sidurim that didn't say La Mishumadim, but instead replaced it with La Malshinim. Therefore, the printed text eventually became, even though everybody knew La Malshinim was just a joke, you're supposed to say La Mishumadim, so many young children and eventually became grown-ups. And the young children who grew up with those Sidurim grew up saying what it says in the Siddur. It's the printed text. It must be the word of God. So they all grew up saying V'la Malshinim or Laminim V'la Malshinim. So many people grew up with that text in their Siddur, and they mistakenly thought that Mishumadim was the original text. Now, when it comes to the theology of this, I'll leave everybody to their own devices. But some have argued that this edit is good. I mean, especially the Reform and the Conservative. It's much better that we stop cursing the apostates and the Christians. What do we have against them anymore? They don't hate us. We don't hate them. We have to leave these old hatreds behind us, these old contempts in the past. I mean, the Holocaust was a bit of a shock. Originally in the Berlin Siddur, they took away Laminim V'Lamoshinim. And then after the Holocaust, they started thinking about that again. But there was actually an interesting turn of events that happened, I think, in the 60s. In the 1960s, one of the popes, I think it was Benedict, one of the popes said in the 1960s, they had this council that was, I think it was, hold on, I don't remember which pope it was, Pope either Benedict or one of the popes in the 1960s decided that they were going to tone down one of the Christian prayers that prayed for the Jews to convert to Christianity. After the Holocaust, they kind of had an introspection. They're like, okay, That tefillah that we say in the church that davens that the Jews should convert to Christianity, let's tone it down. Let's make it a tefillah that the Jews should deepen their faith. Okay. In 2007, Pope Benedict this is the 16th, announced that he wanted to revert it and say, okay, no, we're going to go back to the original Nusach. There's a whole hullabaloo. And the chief rabbi of Italy was forced to make a statement. His name was Rabbi Riccardo Di Segni. And he said like this. He said, Jewish prayers have already been self-censored centuries ago. What has been brought to our attention once more is a history of polemics which goes back thousands of years. Anyone can hear for themselves the prayers which Jews recite today. The essential fact is that today, no reference to Christians exists in our prayers. He had to make a public statement. But there was an international council of Christians and Jews, and they made some bullet points like this. It's like in 2009. They're like, you know what? We're going to make this discussion. The Christians, they're going to look at their liturgy. The Jews, we're going to analyze our liturgy, and we're going to grapple with any texts which are xenophobic or racist. We're going to put them into context. Let's discuss this like mature people. Let's discuss what our liturgies say about each other. So Ruth Langer was sent to go represent, and she gave a speech at this conference, and she made a really good point. She said that if you're talking to traditional Jews, you can't tell them to edit the text. They're not going to touch it. Most of the traditional Jews are so traditional that they'll refuse to even change it from Lamalshinim to Lamushumadim, even though they know that it's fake. They'll still keep it Lamalshinim because that's what our fathers and our forefathers and our grandfathers have said, and that's what the Nusach Hari said. We got to keep it that way. For the traditional Jews, it's much better to beg them to reinterpret. Let them reinterpret the text, not to be against external foes, external Christians, rather against a nebulous force of evil. And that's mostly what Jews today consider the Bracha of HaMinim and HaMashinim. It's a bracha against all the forces of evil, external threats, evil empires, the power of evil in general. Let the traditional Jews reinterpret the text rather than asking them to edit it. If you're talking to the Reform, however, they're much more liberal. The Reform, maybe even the Conservative, they're much more liberal. They can edit the text. And they have a bracha about, I think the Reform changed it to a bracha about destroying evil instead. Like the Chasim has something about lahashpis risha min haaretz. However, what they learned over time is that Conservative and Reform Jews have learned over time that traditional texts work much better than the Reform text. And over time, even the Conservative and Reform prayer books have, well, let me just pause the recording for a second. So essentially what we have today are that most traditional Sidurim, even the conservative ones, contain a bracha very similar to Lamalshinim. They do, however, tone it down. The conservative ones turn it down, and the Reform tried to keep it as similar as possible without talking specifically about apostates or heretics because they are too sensitive, and they like an ever-progressive, ever-changing Torah, so to speak, ever-changing Judaism. However, most of the prayer books retain it and choose to reinterpret it. That's so much for our share on the Berachas HaMinim. I apologize if I didn't reference your favorite source. I know there's so much discussion. I would encourage anybody who can to read the book by Ruth Langer or by Yaakov Tepler. These are incredible resources. They're not so long. You could even borrow the book from archive.org if you want. And Bezrat Hashem, next week, we will continue with the following brachot of Shemona Esrei. So thank you, everybody, for your time and attention, and we will continue next week.